Welcome everyone on this Spring Boot tutorial. So today we'll create a simple application using SpringSecurity and MongoDB. So we'll create two endpoints, one endpoint for user subscription and another one for user authentication. Let's begin by creating a new Spring Boot project. So new project, Spring Searcher project, next. So the name of my project is simple Spring Security project. I'm using Java 8. Next, so we need Spring Boot DevTools, Spring Data MongoDB, Spring Security, and Spring Web. Next, finish. So first of all, I will begin by creating the models for my project. So here I will create a new class, user model. And here I will change the package to models. Finish. And I will create two other models for my subscription and authentication endpoint. So here authentication request. Then authentication response. So in my user model, I will need an ID, private string ID. So this ID will be generated by Spring Data. Then I will need a username and a password. So username and password. So we generate some getter and setter. I don't need a setter for my ID because it will be generated by Spring Data. And I will generate a constructor without field. So here source. Next. So I can delete this because it's called by default. And that's all for now. So in my authentication request, I will need the username and the password. So I will generate a constructor without field. Then I will generate some getter and setter for password and username. Generate. And that's all. And for my authentication request, for now I just need a response. So I will also generate a constructor without field here, then some getter and setter for my response field, and that's all. So I will only use user model in my MongoDB database. So to use this model on MongoDB database, it have to be a document. So I will use the annotation document, and the collection I will call it, for example, users. So that's all. So I will also create a repository for my user model. So here new it will be an interface. So user repository, then finish. So here I have to annotate my repository with repository annotation. Then I have to extend Mongo repository, and here I will use my model, just here, user model, and the ID of the model is a string, so I will put the string in the second object. So I will need a method returning user model. So this method will be find by username, so string username, and that's all. So I have to start MongoDB on localhost. So I have already done a tutorial about starting MongoDB on localhost. So I am in the bin folder or my MongoDB project. So I will just use MongoDB, and now MongoDB is listening on my localhost. So in my robotree, I will open my robotree. Just here. So I am connecting to MongoDB on localhost. So I have to create a database that I can use in my project. So I will go to application properties. First of all, I will change the default port of my project, server port. So for example 8682, and I have to give the MongoDB URI. So for example my MongoDB URI will be localhost/userdb. So here I have to connect to my localhost MongoDB. So we close it and open it another time. I will connect to my localhost. Okay, now I'm good. So here I will create a database. My database will be userdb. So you can see that my application will be connected to this database. So for now there is no collection 0. So now let's create the controller for my different endpoint. So I have to create a new class. For example, auth controller, then finish. So it will be REST controller, and I will have two endpoints, and both of the endpoint will be a post request. So the first request will be auth/auth for authenticate, for example, and my second endpoint will be for subscription. So here I will create the method for my controller. So here response entity, and here subscribe client, for example, and my request body, I will use the authentication request entity, authentication request. So I have to import my authentication request. It's already imported. And in the other method for authenticating, so we'll use the same return type as the response entity. So here authenticate client, and I will use the same request body, authentication request, because I will just need username and password. And Now, for example, every time I want to subscribe a client, so first of all, I will retrieve the username from my request. Then I will retrieve the password. Then here I have to use my repository. So user repository, I will go to my controller. So here private user repository, user repository. So it have to be auto-wire. So I am importing my user repository just here, and here every time a client is subscribing, I will use the user repository to save an entity. So this entity will be user model. So before that, I will create a user model equal new user model. So here I have I don't have a constructor with field. That's not a problem. So I will set the username, and I will set password. Let's share. Then I will save my entity user model. And I have to return a response entity dot okay. Then the response, for example, it can be a new authentication response. Response. So here I have to use a constructor with field. So we go to source using field response. Okay, so that I can use my authentication request just here, and here I can say something. For example, the client is or successful subscription for client. Then I can add the username of my client, and that's all. And if there is an exception just here, so try catch. So we try to save my client in the Mongo database. So here, if we have some problem, so I can use cow, and the body, I don't know if I can use this model just here. Yes, error during client subscription. So that's for my subscription. So for my authentication, now I will begin by configuring the SpringSecurity. So here I have to create security configuration just here. So class, so security configuration, and the package will be configuration to make it cleaner. So finish. So first of all, I have to use the annotation. So enable web security just here, and I will extend web security configurer. Configurer adapter just here. So now I have to create a user service so that my user service will be used in my Spring Security configuration. So here I have to rename the file, and now let's create a service. So new class user service in the package services, finish. So in my user service, first of all, it's a service, so I have to use this annotation service. My user service will be implementing user detail service, user details service. So I have to implement some method. So user detail service is a Spring Security class just here. So if you are curious, you can read the documentation. So when my user service will call this method load by username, so now I have to use my repository. So I will go to my controller, check this user service. So first of all, I will retrieve my user. So find by username. So if I don't find my my user in the Mongo database, I will return null. So if founded user, so if the founded user equal to null, I will return null. Else I will retrieve the username of my user and the password. So your name and password. And now I have to return an object. The object will be user. So return new user. It's a Spring Security object. So here user, I have to give the name, password, and for now I am not using any authorities, so it will be null. And that's all for my user service. So now if I go back to my security configuration, so now I have to use my user service. So just here, so user service, so it must be auto-wired, of course. And now I will try to configure my Authentication Manager builder. So here configure, so I will override this method, and here I will tell my Authentication Manager builder the user details service will be my user service. So every time he will use my method that here to load the user by username. And we have to do some other configuration, because now I am using Spring Security, so every endpoint will be handled by Spring Security. But for example, I need some endpoint to be to not be handled by Spring Security. For example, my two endpoint just here, subscription and authentication. So I will override the configure with HTTP security. Yeah. So here so HTTP I have to disable this and authorize request and matcher. So now I have to tell SpringSecurity for my two endpoint don't handle those endpoint with SpringSecurity. So like that. Then here I am telling permit all, and any request from those endpoint must be authenticated. So I have also to override password encoder. So password so I have to create a method password encoder. Let's share password encoder. So return no password encoder get instance. So here I am changing SpringSecurity to not encode my passwords. And the last thing, so I have to override Authentication Manager just here. So that I can use my Authentication Manager to authenticate my user. And that's all for my SpringSecurity configuration. Then I will return to my Authentication Controller. So I have to get the username and the password for my request. That's here. And here I have to use the Authentication Manager. So here the Authentication Manager will try to authenticate user with this method, and the object will be new username password authentication token, and I will give it the username then the password, and that's all. So here I will have to use a try catch, and because this method can throw a bad credential exception. So in the case I can't authenticate my user, I will return a KO response here. So here, if I am returning a KO response from response entity, so here the authentication will be successful authentication for user, authentication for client username. And in the other case, when the Authentication Manager cannot authenticate the user, so the response will be a KO response. There is no KO response, so I will just return a bad request. or I will return a response entity with a response body, and here error during client authentication. So now I am done. Here I have just created my endpoint for the subscription, then an endpoint for my authentication. So now I will run my application. So start. Then I will open Postman and I will create a new collection, simple security project. Then I will add 2 requests. So authentication request, save, then another request which will be subscription request. So here subscription request. So the 2 requests will be a post. So here post, and my application is running on this port. So here localhost 8682. So here it's for subscription, so the endpoint will be subs, and here my endpoint will be for authentication user, so it will be auth. So in my request body I will use raw text JSON, and here I can take an example, create student for example, why not. So here in my body I will just need a username. For example, username will be mad and the password will be madmax. Full madmax, no, just madmax. And I will prepare my body for the subscription request. So here raw JSON mad and madmax. So I will run my application. I'm not sure that it will work the first time. So here we can have an error during subscription, and here we can have an error during client authentication. So here I have a problem just here. So the Authentication Manager is not working just here. I don't know why. So my Authentication Manager I have to go to Spring configuration, and here it's not the right method, because the right method is Authentication Manager bin. So I will restart my project. Here. And I forgot the annotation bin just here. Then I hope this time it will be working. So my application is started just here. First, I will begin by subscribe user. So in my subscription, I will subscribe Mad Max. Just here. So here you can see I will refresh my Mongo in localhost. Refresh. So here my collection there is 0 element. So send. So here my response is successful subscription for client Mad. That's here. So if I refresh my Mongo database, so here I have my first subscribed user. So the ID is auto-generated by Spring Data. The username is Mad and the password is MadMax. Let's try to authenticate another user. For example, I will put I don't know Paula in username. So here I have an exception, and if I put mad send, I still have an exception. I don't know why. So here in the authentication request, I'm using the Authentication Manager to authenticate using username, password, authentication token. Authenticate. So now I don't see the problem, not yet. Maybe I have some problem just here. Yes, it likes it's missing the bin just here, and it must be public. So now I think we are okay. So I will restart my project. Then I will try to authenticate another user, because now I have seen that MadMax is in the Mongo database. Sure. So my application is just started here. Then I will try to authenticate Paula. Send. So here it's forbidden. Ta-ta, ta-ta. Interval application. I can do better stuff to handle the error in my endpoint, authentication endpoint. So here I will catch any exception and not just bad credential exception. So start. So I want to get my response every time. I don't want to get some other exception for my application. So here I will send my request, and here we have error during client authentication Paula. Why? Because Paula is not present in my database. So I will refresh, and I only have MadMax. So here, if I use MadMax to authenticate, So now it's not working. I think I know why. So here the Authentication Manager is trying to authenticate. So the Authentication Manager have to call the user service method founded user. So here I don't think it's a good idea to put null for authority. So we just put new array list for an empty list. So my application started. I will try to authenticate MadMax. So I still have an error. Why? So we'll put a breakpoint just here and start in debug mode. And I will put a breakpoint here too. So let's go send. So I have to add my project for my breakpoints. So Java project, okay, simple SpringSecurity project. So here the username is mad. Then the next step will be, I'm waiting. So he found the user, the name and the user is password. So what's the problem? What's the exception just here? There is no password encoder mapped for the ID null. So I have to go here. I have used a password encoder. But it must be a bin. So now I think that was the problem. So we restart my project, not in debug mode this time because I am confident, I hope. So now I will try to authenticate MadMax. So now the authentication is successful for client MadMax. Why? Because MadMax is present in the database. If I change the username, for example, Mada, error during client authentication. Send successful authentication. I will change the password, error during authentication. So it's working well now. So we'll subscribe other user, Paula, me, Rola. I don't have any idea of those names. So the subscription is successful for client Paula. So if I refresh my database, refresh userdb share. So here I have Paula. Now I will try to authenticate Paula. So send error. And if I put the right password for Paula, share, and now the authentication is successful. So let's subscribe other user. So user 12, hard password, send successful subscription for user 12. So here, if I refresh my database, then user, and here I have 3 subscribed users. And to authenticate this user, so user 12 with the hard password, send, and the authentication is successful. If I change the password, error during client authentication. So here, refresh. So now but that's the end of this project. So I have created 2 endpoints. The first to subscribe user and to save this user in the Mongo database that we have created just here, user DB. And the other endpoint, auth endpoint, is using the Authentication Manager to try to authenticate the user by its username and the password. So that's all for this tutorial. For the next tutorial, we'll use SpringSecurity with JWT token. So we can use it on a real-world application with React. So thank you for watching, and don't hesitate to subscribe for more tutorials.